Everyone. This is your host, Ryan Edwards, and welcome to the Cryptid Chronicles. Sorry for the interference last night. I wasn't able to schedule a podcast, so we're doing it today. I had some technical issues and some scheduling issues last night, so we want to make sure we're here today. My camera right now is not exactly in the best shape, so it's not working, so we'll have it just as primarily the podcast. We won't have it on camera. So tonight, I have my guest on, Jason McLean. Good friend of mine, met him at the Jefferson Bigfoot Conference last year. Great guy to talk to. He just makes me feel like I added 10 IQ points just talking to the man. He's also an author. He wrote Metroplex Monsters. Great book. He talks about peculiar cryptid sightings up in the Dallas Fort Worth area, up here in northern Texas. He also is a biblical archaeologist. He has done several studies into primarily like living pterosaurs, goat man phenomena, and different cryptids. So real quick, let me bring on Jason and let's start the show.
Hey Ryan, how you doing, man?
Doing good, Jason. It's good to have you on.
No, I'm glad to be here, and I appreciate having to use just using the avatars because I always have this light shining in my face when the camera's on, so I get to turn the light off and just kick back and enjoy it.
Nice. Also, yeah, like over here, I'm probably sweating so much you probably don't even want to see me on camera.
Well, you know what? It'll be fun. We'll just have to use the theater of the mind, as they say.
Let people make their own images in their head. Like,
Yes,
so
they can fantasize about us, being all oiled and in our speedos, hanging out, wrestling some Bigfoot and some Crocs.
usual imagination.
Usual imagination. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. And so with Jason, I know I did a little introduction for yourself, for you, but I know probably my introduction wasn't at all like how you would introduce yourself. So for the one at home that doesn't know you or has maybe heard of you, but maybe not your research, introduce yourself.
Well, again, I mean, you hit all the main points. Author, illustrator, vodcaster. Again, yeah, a lot of my I'm more of a generalist than anything else, but a lot of my public facing work is on, uh, the things in and around Texas and living pterosaurs in general, or specifically. But I am a generalist because I believe that all this phenomena are pieces of a puzzle. I think the problem is a lot of people get caught up, and we should have specialists. Don't get me wrong, but we get caught up on Bigfoot or Dogman, and so there's a very narrow window, and it's like, well, hold on. Why don't we take that step back and say, what does all of this phenomena tell us? What does all of these fourtean phenomena tell us? Whether it's ufology, the paranormal, forbidden archaeology, cryptozoology, what does this really tell us about about the world we inhabit? It's a very short book. It's only like 30 something pages long. It's a little booklet I did a while back called "How UFOs and Bigfoot Prove the Bible is True," and that's basically in a nutshell, my argument is that all of this phenomena actually points to the fact that the narrative that we've been sold by the mainstream is radically incorrect. Because if it was correct, we wouldn't have these creatures. We wouldn't have this other phenomena. We wouldn't have these archaeological finds that don't conform to the mainstream narrative. And it's not that they just seem out of place; they radically don't conform. The modern conception of what the history of this planet is just fundamentally wrong. And I would even take it one step further to say deliberately so. There are, something I really haven't talked about a lot, but I have now, is that my original plan was to be an archaeologist. It was to combine art, being an actual artist, and looking into art history and archaeology was the plan, because we have a lot of people who talk about things that, from an archaeological perspective, that they have no experience in doing the actual thing, right? If you're not that's why people had to rediscover flint napping, because once we had a lot of theories about flint napping that once we actually started doing it, we recreated the technology sort of to understand what they were doing. A lot of opinions and thoughts changed. Well, as an artist, that was my plan, to bring someone who is actually an artist, who actually handles these materials, and understands how art works, to the game. And then what I saw, what I found in the archaeological world, honestly tells me we're being lied to pretty universally. Now, don't get me wrong, there are people doing good work. There really are. However, there's a very narrow window from which you're allowed to do good, honest work. If you find certain things, you either shut up about it, you find a way to dismiss it, or you become a florist. So that's what my work is basically on. It's taking a look at all these things and saying, okay, what does this actually tell us? How should we really look at it? I don't think any of this is simple or easy, but it can be done. But we need to be honest, and we need to be willing to put all of the pieces on the table. What I found is, regardless of what camp you're in, most people throw out pieces they don't like, right? And so all I'm asking, and we do this on the channel all the time, Texas Front Porch. I'm on 3 nights a week. That's what we do, is we take all we just say, well, let's get all these puzzle pieces and put them on the table, whether it makes sense to us or not. Let's at least get them on the table so we can start figuring this out. Because right now, all this phenomena, these groups tend to omit phenomena, and their accounts are often sanitized, we found. So all we're saying is, hey, let's just get everything on the table, and then we can start actually maybe coming to some answers about this.
Yes, what is, like, you do see an interconnection between, like, cryptozoology, ufology, paranormal, demonology, even like forbidden archaeology, and even like the whole ancient astronaut hypothesis. But like with me, I'm
Mhm.
very much a kind of a specialist. Like with cryptozoology, I just see that as cryptozoology.
Right.
Ufology, that's ufology. Paranormal studies, that's just paranormal studies. And I don't really interconnect them. But sometimes you do find that interconnected tissue that might connect Bigfoot to like maybe paranormal events and things like that.
Yes.
And that's just things that kind of interest me the most because I'm very much an aper. I'm very much these creatures are physical creatures. But when I find data that kind of counteracts that hypothesis, I don't just take it out of the equation. I want to add it to the equation and see how can I fit it into my paradigm, or how can I change
Right.
my paradigm to fit the data that is being added.
No, exactly. And that's what, again, Texas Front Porch, TEX apostrophe S Front Porch. That's what we've been playing with, is saying, okay, well, hold on. Once you get all these pieces on the table, you start noticing different patterns, right? And one of the first things I think, and I really sort of saw it when I was writing the book, so I was able to bring this to the channel when I joined. When I was writing Metroplex Monsters, one of the things I noticed very, very quickly, and I didn't expect to see it, was when I was writing about the Goat Man phenomena in the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex. I realized pretty quickly, because I had them all in front of me laid out, the same words were being used as far as what was described. And I recognized it because I'd just written about it, was they were all essentially excerpts from the Jim Mars accounts of the Lake Worth monster. And what I realized was the name Goatman sort of overwrote Bigfoot, right? So that became the local name for Bigfoot. But the problem is that name gets put onto places like Goatman's Bridge in Denton, Texas, which is, Old Alton Bridge, very,
Yeah.
very famous. And the thing is, there's a difference between what people say is seen and what people actually see, right? Because there's the lore, but then there's what people actually encounter, and what people encounter is entirely paranormal, like extremely paranormal. And I started to realize this entire phenomena, and we see it with, like, a great example is also chupacabra, right? Where one of the reasons I thought the chupacabra was purely mythical in the late 90s, early 2000s, was because you had radically different descriptions of the creature, right? If you
Yeah.
were around late 90s, early 2000s, like, there was this alien looking thing with spines. There was a kind of kangaroo looking thing. And then they were radically different descriptions. And my whole thought process was, Bigfoot's real because we have a very consistent description of what Bigfoot looks like. Living pterosaurs. I mean, and we'll get more into that, but very consistent descriptions with unconnected people. So the fact there were so many radically different descriptions of the chupacabra, I was like, well, they can't be real. And the more I've looked into it, the more I realized, no, what you have, and this sort of broke open the whole thing for me, was you have the name chupacabra being applied to different phenomena.
Yes.
And then what ends up happening is people then try and lay the stuff that that is quote unquote chupacabra on top of it. That's why you had this weird looking kangaroo thing with spines. Well, the whole spine thing came from the original quote unquote sightings in Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah.
And the woman who saw it said it looked, because the movie Species with Natasha Henstridge had just come out. So she had likened the creature she saw to Syl, because there were all these posters, right? She was just saying it was something weird and unusual. People took it literally. Well, Syl has these spines on her in the film when she's gone full alien. So that got laid on. So you have this lore and mythology and urban legend being put on top of it, and the name then gets put on this different phenomena. Well, to your question or your point about Bigfoot, it's like, how do we figure out Bigfoot? I would argue when you take that broader step back and you take the name away from things, you start seeing, oh, there's multiple phenomena happening here, right? Because why is it in the places where we get all these, Bigfoot's talking to me and it's telepathic and it's disappearing and it's cloaking, and you get all these stories, right? I'm not saying they're wrong. What I'm saying, though, is we're making the assumption that it's Bigfoot, because oftentimes with all the weird Bigfoot phenomena, you have other weird phenomena happening, UFO sightings, other, poltergeist-like activity, stuff that if you were in Europe 1,000 years ago, they would have said was will-o'-the-wisp kind of stuff, very Fae-like behavior, batteries going out, fully charged batteries going out. Weird electronic phenomena. Like it's all so connected that you're like, well, maybe the problem we have here is we're calling that stuff Bigfoot also. And there is an ape, or something. There's a hominid of some kind running around out there. We have too much physical evidence to say that it's not there. Now, I can't say that physical creature isn't also paranormal, right? I can't say that for certain. But what I will say is we have a lot of physical phenomena that that's observable. We can cast the tracks. We have it just doing, and when people see them, they're just doing normal things, right? Like they're eating or they're walking somewhere. But then we have these other things that follow you 80 miles and poke at your tent, or they follow you home in the city and no one sees anything. They talk to you telepathically. At that point, it's like, well, okay, this feels so much like so many other paranormal phenomena. But then it comes back to why is this paranormal phenomena telling people that they're Bigfoot? Or why do people see them in their Bigfoot and they see as Bigfoot? Honestly, because they want us to think they're Bigfoot, because it wipes away the paranormal aspect of it. Right? How often do people say, think of it this way. You wake up and you're in your bed. I talked to somebody that wake up there in their bed and they're like, I woke up in the middle of the night and there was this tall, giant humanoid creature in my room with red glowing eyes. Well, that's a shadow person, or it's a demon, or it's a poltergeist, whatever you want to call it. But then the next person comes to you and said, well, I was in my tent and I heard something. So I unzipped it and there was this giant, tall, humanoid black creature with red glowing eyes. Well, instantly it becomes Bigfoot. And so our working hypothesis on Texas Front Porch is that there are paranormal creatures, and they are deliberately using the Bigfoot phenomena to hide their actual actions, to hide their intentions. And that's why we have this weird discrepancy. That's why you have this weird paranormal phenomena, then you have the other stuff. Because, and we came to it sort of very, very accidentally. I mean, like I said, there was a lot of buildup to it, but we had this evening, we didn't have a guest. And I decided, Tex was talking about some stuff from Brown Springs, and I decided to play devil's advocate, right? And say, okay, if Bigfoot's real, why aren't we finding the bodies? And I start off with, please understand, my archaeology professor, who was literally like, I had like 2 classes that weren't him. The man was actually one of Grover Krantz's students and was a friend of his. I heard all of the Bigfoot stories from about Grover Krantz from someone who was there for them, right? I know all the arguments. And I said, okay, I get all those arguments. And we've even pointed out, we've actually had a friend of ours, Crypto Hulk, on the show, right? Jeff Stewart. He pointed out we may have Bigfoot remains sitting somewhere in a police station, unidentified or identified as unknown human remains, because if you don't have the skull, if you don't have the pelvis, if you don't have a large percentage of the articulated skeleton, or it's not a giant bull male, you may not recognize it as non-human, right? So we were sort of, and I'm like, let's put all that in. But if we have these creatures being seen all the time, right? And so we started pushing back and forth, and finally he said, okay, and I, it's like, we have all, he goes, but what if Bigfoot's the distraction? And that's why I like playing devil's advocate sometimes, because when you push when you ask why a little too often, sometimes you find something that's a little more true than you want it to be. And so our working theory is the reason we have, there are Bigfoot everywhere, right? But they aren't as everywhere as we think. This is why we're not finding the bodies. They just have to die somewhere that we aren't. But the reason we have so much more, I think probably even the majority of sightings occur with such regularity, is because those aren't Bigfoot. They are creatures that want us to think that they're Bigfoot, so we don't recognize them for what they are.
And that's a high possibility, because like, with referencing what you said earlier with like perception, like there's something I always say. Like, I was actually having a conversation with Kenny Gerhardt about this the other day. Perception is not reality. What you perceive and what you see is not exactly what you will remember. Like, if
Right.
you have like the Mandela effect or pseudo memories, or even
Mm-hmm.
like, people don't realize you could have had a really realistic dream back when you were 5, and soon enough that dream becomes a memory.
Yeah.
Something like that. Just that's how the brain works. And a lot of times when people see these like cryptozoological creatures, like even on the, well, a lot of people reference, like even like Joe Nickel references them quite a bit. Size. Okay, you see a 6 foot creature is a 10 foot creature. You see like something like that. But what if this creature is somehow changing the perception of it? And
Yeah.
like with what you were referencing earlier, like the chupacabra. Like, there's something I always talk about with especially that particular creature, because chupacabra means goat sucker. So what you're referencing is not a particular like description; it's a behavior set.
Right.
If it's killing creatures and somehow draining them of blood, that's chupacabra. But like, let's just take, especially in Mexico, Texas, the Southwest, anything that's strange and maybe kills animals is a chupacabra.
Right.
Typically,
Exactly.
yeah, like I remember a couple of, back when I was a kid, I think I watched like Scooby Doo, and there was a Scooby Doo episode about the chupacabra. And when you see it, it's pretty much a Bigfoot. And like, oh, it's the just South American Bigfoot. That's because the name itself is proliferated more than the actual creature. The
Right.
cultural ideas behind it are no longer really there, and just the name is left. Like
Oh,
with,
exactly.
yeah, like with the Sasquatch. Sasquatch's ideas have persisted. A large, hairy man-like creature living in the woods, but also the cultural ideas of it from the indigenous people have kind of gone with it. But also, the indigenous cultures have referenced certain ideas like mind speak and mind control, and being able to like shock someone, like zap them. And these ideas were lost for a long time until recently. More paranormal ideas have gone into the Bigfoot field. And now all these paranormal abilities, or are they maybe just abilities we don't understand yet? And that's kind of
Right.
idea we have to come at. Because with it, a lot of people say, well, magic's just science we don't understand. But what if science is just kind of a form of magic in and of itself? Oh, because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of this could just come down to just science and perception. And how does someone's, well, preconceived beliefs affect their reality? There's like one thing I reference with the goat man cryptid in my book. It's, well, if someone believes in a goat man, if they have that perception of it existing, they're more likely to see it in their reality. It's
Right.
like, for instance, if you are very highly religious and you might see a kind of a cross in the sky, you might see like, oh, that's Jesus or that's God, because you already have that preconceived belief already at hand.
Hmm.
So if you have like even a belief in Bigfoot, like people say you have Bigfoot on the brain. If you see a bear track that's weird, you say it's Bigfoot. Well, not
Right.
necessarily, but also at the time that is how people work. If we have a preconceived belief set, we expect to see that being or that phenomena in all living life. So, like with creatures like dog and goat man, that might occur. Like I
Hmm.
remember, I think Brad Steger writes about. I think there was one story in one of his books that there was a child playing hide and seek, and he was hiding under a bed, and the door opened up, and a bipedal wolf walked in. He described it as like a big bad wolf. Now, is that a dog man? Of course not. It's something that's not physical. And even Linda Godfrey references bedtime visitors, people that wake up in the middle of the night and they see a Anubis looking creature in their bedroom. Now, is that like the same phenomenon as the dog man that we see on like in Elkhorn and in parts of Texas and parts of the Midwest? It could be, but all you're changing is the setting. You have the same description, the same ideas, but how does the belief affect human perception? Because we've had ideas of like werewolves for hundreds of thousands of years, and if you believe in a werewolf, are you more likely to see a dog man, or vice versa? That's just kind of how we have to see it in this field.
Well, exactly. In fact, this is again, this goes back to the whole question, right? It's like if you were to sit me and oh, I just forgot his name, Giorgio Tsoukalos from Ancient Aliens, right? If you were to sit us at a table, we would agree on this fundamental premise that the UFOs and aliens of today are the gods and angels of the last of the ancient world and demons of the ancient world. The difference would be, I would argue we got it right the first time. He would argue that we got it wrong back then. And one of the reasons one of the things I point to, again, there's a lot of reasons for this, but it seems like this phenomena uh, takes a lot of different forms. It's like when you get rid of the names of things. Again, don't talk about what people say is seen. Take the actual accounts and look at what's actually seen. What do people actually talk about? And when you do that, very distinct patterns pop up. For example, um, I can have missing time. Why is it that we see people out looking for Bigfoot, people doing ghost hunting, and then you have alien abductees all have the same stories of missing time, similar phenomena, but the things that they see perpetrating this are radically different. Why is it, some people it's a giant bird person that was dancing on top of a water cistern here in Texas. Another people it looks like, or another person looks like a demon literally coming through a wall. For another person, it looks like a gray alien. When you start looking at, again, all of the stories, you realize these are all the same stories that people have been talking about for thousands of years. But the thing looks different every time. That tells me what we're seeing is not the actual creature. Even oh, I just forgot his name. I'm terrible with names. Communion. Um, the gentleman who wrote Communion.
Yeah.
I I can see it in my head. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Even he flat out says what we're seeing is not what they are. Jacques Vallée, right? They, agent, a lot of these, particularly the early ufologists, all came out and said, look, whatever these things really are, they aren't what they're presenting themselves as, right? They are not these creatures from another planet. They are something else. You can't, why is it that people who have abduction phenomena also have activity that you would equate to poltergeist activity? Why is it that there are hundreds of accounts of people ending abductions or ending these experiences with traditional Christian exorcism techniques? Why is it that people who, again, are abducted also have history of ritualistic satanic abuse. I can't tell you how many people I've had who were like, yes, I had these encounters with these aliens. And this is something that happened on air, so I'm not breaking any confidences. I just won't use her name. She would, when she was working in the she was in the nuclear biological sort of division of the U.S. military, right? Again, this is publicly facing, so I'm not telling anybody anything that I'm not. If you come to me and you talk to me, I keep everything under wraps unless you tell me it's okay to talk about. So, but this happened on air. So she worked at the Dulce base, and she talked about how it was weird that they would see essentially what we would call the tall whites. And it was just, you just didn't talk about it. And the thing is, though, she also, when she was a child, her and her sister, her twin sister, would go down and when they were young, they would be given, their mother would send them to their grandmother's house while her parents were going through a divorce. Her father finally got custody and was able to get her out of the situation, but weird things would, quote unquote, happen at her grandmother's house, and her mother was very aware of it. But one of the instances she describes, because her mother and her grandmother kept saying, "Oh, you're just imagining things," was a humanoid owl in a cloak walked into her and her sister's room and sat on their bed. And she goes, "I could feel it." And she goes, "This wasn't a mask." She was very adamant. This wasn't maybe an occultist in a mask. She said the eyes blinked, the face moved. She goes, "The only thing I could describe it as was an owl. But it was a human in a cloak, but it had an owl head, and it walked in and sat on her bed." And then she has missing time after that. There's too much connection to the paranormal and the ufological phenomena to ignore. There's too many instances of people who are going, quote unquote, ghost hunting, having missing time and having all, this stuff. Again, it's all connected. The problem is one of the reasons I think popular media, and that's been something we're talking about a lot on the channel as well, is things like ideological subversion, the MK Ultra projects, how narratives control our ways of thinking, so so that our paradigms prevent us from seeing the obvious. One of the reasons I think they want us to see things only as UFO or only as crypto or only as ghost hunting is so that we miss the obvious parallels. Because once you take that step back and you try to remove the names from things, the patterns become frighteningly clear. And you're like, this is all the same phenomena. It's just we called them different names 1,000 years ago, right? Today we call it a lechusa, but back then it was a harpy or a siren or Lilith. Today we call them goatmen, but back then it was the Leshy of the Indo-Russians. It was the fauns and satyrs of the Greeks and Romans. It was the shahadim of the Hebrew. Like, these creatures have been around us forever, but they've gone by different names, and they do change their appearance by culture. Ours is a very technologically advanced culture. It's very sophisticated, and that allows them to hide. They just hide behind this idea of technology. C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters had this little conversation. I'm going to sum it up because it's kind of a long conversation, but he sums it up by saying that with this theory of creating, again, this is the context is these are demons talking to one another, right? In the Screwtape Letters. But he comes up with this idea of the materialist witch, meaning someone who a demon could torment directly, but at no time do they consider it to be a non-material phenomena, so they never think about God, right? And I think that the modern UFO phenomena is sort of that manifestation of what C.S. Lewis sort of predicted, because it allows them to do supernatural things without us ever thinking about the supernatural. Well, for those who are open to the supernatural or open to the cryptozoological, they're taking those forms as well. So I think we're seeing a lot of different phenomena. Again, I do believe there's a physical Bigfoot. That's the hypothesis. There is a naturally existing creature. I think these pterosaurs are naturally existing. I think a lot of this stuff is naturally existing, and because they behave that way. But then there's this other phenomena that doesn't. And it takes so many different shapes, but when you remove the name and you remove sort of the cultural biases from it, it's all behaving the same way and it's all doing the same thing.
Yeah, like how you bring up like with Goatman and the ideas of satyrs or Beleshi in the past. Like even like with living pterosaurs, we had ideas of the dragons in the past, and it's
Yes.
very similar descriptions. And people, of course, say, well, people have ideas of dragons because they find dinosaur skeletons or fossils. And I'm like, well, that's a possibility. But also, how do they know the morphology so well? The
Yeah.
scaly skin, ideas of like bat-like wings. So, unless they maybe saw these creatures that have persisted since the presumed extinction date.
Oh,
So
yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, a great example of that is the cockatrix, right? Um, very, very different from, I would argue that the stuff that we're seeing today is what we would call a wyvern, right?
yes,
But let's look at the cockatrix for just a moment. It's the most ridiculous looking dragon you can imagine, right? It has the head and upper body of a chicken, and then has the legs and tail of a dragon. That sounds totally ridiculous to us, but realize what the drawings that we're seeing are based off of accounts that were given hundreds or thousands of years ago. These were people who were seeing something and saying, this is what it looked like, right? Well, take the account seriously, but not literally. They're just equating it to animals that they knew. Okay. Well, let me rephrase this. What would someone living in Persia 1,000 years ago, or some Germanic tribesmen, how would they describe something like, say, a velociraptor, which we now know had feathers, or something even more specific like the I'm terrible with the names. They had the beaks and and they have like that crest on their head. Um,
uh, the
we
cassowary.
No, well, no, not the cassowary, but they kind of remind me of cassowaries actually, but they're
Yeah,
they're theropods. They were oh, oviraptors. I knew the
okay.
name. It was an egg. It's like we thought that they
The
were
egg
egg.
stealer. Yeah,
Yeah, we now know they weren't. They were just very, very protective of their eggs. But here's the thing, right? That was, if you don't know what an oviraptor looked like, it was basically, imagine the velociraptors from or any of the theropods from Jurassic Park, but it has a very curved beak and a head crest like a cassowary. Well, imagine seeing that creature. We know they had feathers now. Imagine you live in, you lived in Europe, or you lived in Persia, and one of these things attacks your cow, or attacks your goat, or just runs past you. How would you describe that to the rest of your village, or your village elders, or to your leaders? It's like, hey, we're getting attacked by a pack of these dragons that looked like they had chicken heads and they had feathers, right? So you describe them as looking like a dragon with a chicken head. Because you don't have this other language. Today we'd look and say, oh, that's a dinosaur. But they didn't have that kind of language. So they didn't have that way of conceptualizing what they were seeing. So they were describing it the way they could. So how did they know that there were theropods that had feathers? They couldn't have possibly known that. We've only figured that out over the last 20, 30 years. And that's because we have very sophisticated techniques to examine them. And to your point, let's look at the wyvern. Let's look at the actual description of the wyvern. In fact, there are drawings of what was the body of a wyvern, right, that was on display in France in the late 1500s, early 1600s. Now, the thing is, the drawings are of a gaff, right? Like, it's very clear this was a gaff. We can even, because the drawings were so detailed, we can tell which body parts were used to make the gaff. But we have to remember, this was a century after an event that was well recorded, of a farmer finding a small dragon, accidentally killing it because it was hissing at his cows. He smacked it in the head trying to drive it off, but it died. And so he's like, well, I'll take this to the, to the museum, to Paris, to the museum, so they can have this dragon. Well, They don't have formaldehyde. The body deteriorates and goes away. So they make a gaff of it, right? Well, these drawings of this gaff, there's 3 different artists over a 20-year period draw this creature or this gaff that's on display. And you may say, well, if it's a gaff, how can you know that they saw a real dragon? Well, because of the features of it. It has a tooth attached to the tip of the snout. It is shown as having 3 claws on the fold of the wing, right? Of the wings. It only has 1 pair of legs and a long tail. Well, guess what? That is a perfect description of a rhamphorhactoid pterosaur. Also, about this time in history, and even before these drawings took place, is when the heraldry of dragons changed, specifically the wyvern. This is where we start getting these what we would consider the traditional dragon tail, that flange on the end, that sort of diamond-like flange, that appears in heraldic artwork at that time. So please explain to me how these these French aristocrats and academics were able to create a gaff that has 3 features unique to a pterosaur. 100 years before that, the wyvern is now being depicted as having a flanged tail on the end. If they hadn't actually encountered a real living rhamphorhactoid pterosaur, like the kind I saw 30 years ago now, I'm getting old. The kind I've seen, like and like so many other people I've talked to here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and in other places that are describing the same creature. The obvious answer is these things have always been around. We've seen them for thousands of years. We just called them dragons. We called them wyverns. We now call them pterosaurs. It's the same phenomena going by different names. In our modern culture, though, has gone out of its way to hide that so that we can't see it for what it is. It's distracting us because they want us to not recognize the truth because they have an agenda.
Hey, Jason, sorry about that.
Yep. Oh, no problem, man.
Yeah, because what you were referencing earlier with showing flanges at the end of the tails and things like that. There's certain more like fleshy descriptions of like pterosaurs and dinosaurs that they're referencing in mythology that they shouldn't know about.
Exactly.
And also too, like there's also references to like feathers and also pycnofibers. Like when people talk about like pterosaurs, there's some eyewitnesses that what they talk about is like scaly dragon-like creatures. But if we look at the paleontological record, these creatures really didn't look like that. The late, at least Cretaceous pterosaurs didn't really have the long tails or anything like that. But they also had pycnofibers, almost like feathers or fur-like filaments along the body. And some eyewitnesses even described that. And
exactly.
That isn't really shown in common media. Like if you look at like Jurassic Park or something like that, they don't demonstrate that.
So, exactly.
Unless this person has some type of knowledge of paleontology, how are they referencing something that they shouldn't know about?
Well, and before we even discovered it, like that's the other thing, right? Yeah. So many of these accounts are talking about things that we didn't know about today. And to your point, one of the things that literally I took 20 years before I ever talked about my sighting, because I didn't believe something like that could be in that area. Also, because people don't talk about, like, I was one of the first encounters in North Texas that Ken Gerhardt took. I've got plenty now once I started talking about it, people came to me and said, hey, this is what happened. I found people randomly, just asked them. They're like, without leading, I was like, hey, have you ever seen anything weird? And they're like, yeah, let me tell you this story about something that happened to me a couple of years ago. And they're talking about a living pterosaur. There are so many people who've had these encounters. They either, and I would argue a lot of them actually write it off as something like a crane. And here's why. Living pterosaurs are not sexy like Bigfoot, at least in modern media, right? Let's face it, most people could fake a Bigfoot encounter by watching enough episodes of Finding Bigfoot. But there really isn't a lot on living pterosaurs. So when I hear people saying almost universally, I thought I was looking at a crane or a heron or a pelican because of its overall body shape. And because it does that, how when they fly, they'll do that S curve thing with their neck where they sort of sit their head on their shoulders, right?
Yeah.
And they'll stick like a crane will stick its legs out from behind it. That was my first thought. I thought I was looking at the biggest blue heron I'd ever seen. It had a wingspan of 8 to 10 feet because I was in a creek. I knew how wide the walls were. I could see how big this thing was. I just thought I was looking at the biggest blue heron I'd ever seen in my life. That's all I thought I was looking at. It wasn't until it was 5 feet in front of me that I realized, oh, it doesn't have feathers. It's a membrane. And those aren't legs. It's a tail with a flange at the end. Literally everyone I've spoken to said, again, most of my encounters of these people that I've spoken with are in broad daylight, just like mine was. I have one at night, and the encounter at night, the thing flew right in front of her headlights. She thought at first she said she thought it was a giant owl because when it flew beside her, because it's nighttime, you don't think pelican or heron at night. And when the thing flew right in front of her, she's like, in her high beams, she's like, that was a dinosaur. She said she grew up, her brothers were all into dinosaurs. She goes, I knew what I was looking at. But the other aspect of this is, if people are going to fake something, they fake, and I have a slightly misspent youth. When someone fakes artwork, right? If they're going to fake a Rembrandt or whatever, they look for pieces that exist, right? They're trying to create a forgery of something that someone's looking for. They don't create something there's no record of, right? Because that's the easiest way to get caught. You kind of when you create a forgery, you create what people are looking for or expecting. In the same way, if all of these people, myself included, were somehow hallucinating or just making up this story about these living pterosaurs, we'd use the pterodactyl because that's the most popularly known creature, right? It has the head crest, it has a beak, it has no tail. They're giant. They're what you show, they're on the Flintstones, they're in all of these movies, right? They use a pterodactyl. That's the popular one. But all of these people I've talked to are talking about rhamphoractoids. They were smaller, they're much less known, and yet we're all having the same description. We're describing them the same way, and we have no contact with one another. There's that overlap that we're all seeing the same thing, and that allows you to sort of reverse engineer some things. Like there's that very famous example of a sighting where it was a much larger creature out in the 60s in Cuba, right? Well, the guy drew it as having a large flanged tail, and he even draws teeth on what's clearly a pterodactyl. I, for the longest time, thought, well, maybe this guy's making it up because it looks a little too much like what you would expect to see in like some sort of comic book, right? A pterodactyl with teeth. But the longer I thought about it, the more I realized, here's the problem. The way humans see things is we associate with things that are known to us. He's putting that flanged tail in. And I have had people who've seen these smaller 8 to 10 foot, wingspan pterosaurs. They describe a minor crest. So once I get rid of my preconceived notions that because it's a rhamphoractoid, it can't have a crest, right? Because we don't know if the Scaganathus, we think probably may have had some kind of a crest. So once I start getting rid of that in my head, I'm like, well, he didn't sit there and draw. This thing didn't sit there and pose for him like it's a life drawing class, right? He's drawing what he remembers. Well, his brain is full of all of these pterodactyls, but he includes the tail and he includes teeth because that's what he saw. But it's colored by his familiarity with the pterodactyl, and I think that's what we see with a lot of these. So we have people who are like, they're, in their head, they're like, I know what a pterodactyl is. This is the closest thing I have to it. And the brain sort of overlaps the two. So when they do point out things that pterodactyls didn't have, like a long flanged tail and teeth, you realize, okay, we have some bleed over. They're trying to tell you something that they were unfamiliar with, something that they've never seen before, and they're using the language of what they know. And it's that level of consistency that tells me these creatures are still alive to this day. People tell me, it's like, hey, I saw this, am I crazy? Well, I can't tell you if you're crazy or not, but I can tell you you're not wrong, right? And when you just step back and you look at a lot of these descriptions throughout history, take them seriously, but don't take them literally. You see these other, and again, not just pterosaurs, you see other creatures like dinosaurs and and the Elasmotherium, which I think is probably the unicorn. They immediately snap into place because you realize, oh, these were people just trying to tell us what they had encountered and seen using the language they had. It is us in our modern arrogance, and honestly, bolstered by an academic world that has this very specific agenda, that is telling us that they were just ignorant people who were just making up, mythology and fairy tales. No, these were real humans who had real encounters, and just like we're having today.
Yes, like that's one thing that I always do bring up, like what we talked about earlier with perception, and like especially the living pterosaur debate. With me, there are certain issues I have with the phenomenon itself. Like, for instance, a long flanged tail. That's something that we do see in Ranforicoid pterosaurs, smaller pterosaurs, which does correlate to a lot of eyewitnesses. But also, let's take, for instance, like the ropen of Papua New Guinea. People describing almost like a pteranodon, the
Yeah.
long beak, the long head crest, but then they're also describing a long tail, which is a description of a Ranforicoid. These are two pterosaurs that are not at all related. They're just kind of convergently evolved. So people are mixing up these descriptions, but it's of different creatures. Like one thing I always bring up is the roe. This was pretty much a cryptid I've seen in, I believe it was Western New Guinea. Pretty much what this couple went down to New Guinea and they met a local tribe, the Kiriri, and they described a large creature with a long neck, long tail, spikes down its back, and a almost like a tyrannosaur-like head and a crest. And of course, what they're describing is a dinosaur, but they're describing several different dinosaurs at once. The plates of stegosaur, the head frill of a sometimes ceratopsy, and of course like a sauropod's neck and all that. So they're describing cultural anachronisms of what we thought dinosaurs looked like back in the early 1900s. And like even this sometimes occurs in and even in Africa. A lot of people describe like the sauropods. Like Bukele and Bembe describe it living mostly in the water. And of course, back in the 1960s and before, we believed sauropods live in the water primarily to help support their bodies. And nowadays, we know that's not true. So people are using what we used to think about these creatures in modern day references and eyewitness accounts. And it's
Well,
kind of mixes it up, but also there are references to what we know is truly zoological and pathological, like feathers and other behavioral sets that we can presume from the pathological record.
so a couple of things on that, like with Mukele and Bembe is what you're referring to. There's actually the idea of water being again not aquatic, but again something like a hippopotamus is
Yes.
actually, because that is coming back into vogue for certain for the sauropods and particularly some of the larger ones. The problem is we have to remember this is one of the things I saw as an archaeologist. One of the big problems we have is that we look at things and say, okay, we know what this was. No, you don't. I got too many stories of of things that were mainstream archaeological belief that when we were able to do some good ethnography, we realized that we were just catastrophically wrong. So the problem is we have to remember paleontologists are working with bones and just whatever survives. So we don't really know. But the idea of some of these sauropods living in water is coming back into vogue now because of their, again, back to because of their size. Now, Is it the way it was depicted in the 60s? No, not at all. But it's still, but it's coming back into vogue a little bit as something more like a hippopotamus to sort of help with its buoyancy. But let me go back to, and let me push back a little bit on the roping a bit. You're right, which is again, when I was looking at the guy from who saw it in Cuba, the soldier from who saw it in Cuba, I do think there was some cultural expectations that were coloring his viewpoint. But we have one of two options here, right? Either there are two completely different species, and there may be even more, because I mean, you have the Kangamato of Africa,
Yes.
And you've got the roping of Papua New Guinea. So we can never say that we don't have multiple species living at the same time. However, the hypothesis I'm working with is that what we're seeing here in North Texas, southern Oklahoma, and moving outwards towards the west is that we're seeing juveniles. We can't necessarily rule out the idea that, again, these may not be the same rhamphorhactoids that we have in the fossil record. They may have adapted, grown, evolved, changed to have maybe a longer lifespan, or maybe they do grow larger. They stay here, and then as they get to a certain size, they move out and they grow larger. And we have to remember things like, well, the beak. It's like, well, this one has a beak and a tail. Well, again, people aren't sitting here looking at this creature for an hour, right, to examine it. They're seeing it very, very quickly. A rhamphorhactoid has a spike at the end of its nose, right? That's actually where the species gets its name. Now, not all rhamphorhactoids did, but because this is a feature that we see in the wyvern very early on in the heraldic art, and again, it appears at the same time as the flanged tail. We have to realize people may see this thing and see it as a beak, right? Because I mean, that's what rhamphorhacus means, is tooth beaked. That tooth at the end of its snout makes it look like it has a beak. So people see it, they're like, well, it's got a beak. Plus, again, they have all this cultural talking, this cultural information about a pteranodon. So it's arrogant of us to say, well, rhamphorhactoids can't get that big. We don't know what they could do. What we have is what's of record. We don't know that there weren't larger species running around. I mean, right now, the largest species we have on record for the rhamphorhactoids was about 8 to 10 feet as far as the wingspan, which very closely corresponds with what is seen here in North Texas. However, until we have more information, we can't say that they couldn't have gotten larger, that there wasn't a rhamphorhactoid species that did get larger, or that the species that survived to today can grow larger. And perhaps once it reaches a certain size, it moves to what we see in South Texas, right? The Brownsville incident, all the accounts that Ken Gerhardt takes in Big Bird. Again, I've got stories of people, driving in from New Mexico and Arizona back into Texas, and they talk about creatures, these flying creatures that have wingspans that cover a 2-lane highway. And they're like, I could tell. They're like, all I knew is that they use the word bird, because they couldn't see it directly. They just saw that it was blocking out the stars, but that the wingspan went from one edge of the highway to the other. That's way more than 10 feet. So the question is, do we have two? We could suggest perhaps there's two different species of pterosaur out there, or we have one species at different stages of development, right? This is one of those things that we need to be very open to. Now, again, we do need to look and say, well, maybe there's some cultural things here happening from time to time, but we also need to look and say, but when people account for things, they're saying that they're seeing the same details over and over and over again, particularly in something that's not as culturally, flashy like Bigfoot. We need to remember, we need to be willing to say, okay, if they're seeing this over and over and over and over again, we need to take that seriously. Again, maybe not literally, but definitely take it seriously. Because here's the other problem. Maybe not all of these weird things that people see in the sky are pterosaurs, right? I mean, we do have accounts of giant condors, and I've got several stories of, I've got one story that's definitely in Lechusa, and I took 3 different gargoyle accounts in like a 2-month span. And they said, no. I'm like, well, maybe this was a pterosaur. They're like, no. I saw this thing. It had a human-like face with long ears. But it was a gargoyle. They straight up said that was the word. Like, this is what it was. They got a really good look at these things. Again, 3 different completely disconnected accounts of gargoyles. Now, what do you do with that, right? Which goes back to we need to have, not a brain so open that or a mind so open our brain falls out, but we need to be able to take a lot of these accounts seriously and say we don't need to necessarily plug everything into a paradigm that already exists. We need to be willing to say what are these phenomena telling us, and create a new paradigm to account for it and say, well, what does this really look like? I'm not saying that they saw an actual gargoyle. What they're saying is they saw something that looked like a gargoyle. Again, going back to the whole paranormal thing, is it possible that creature took that form because they wanted us to say, what do you do with that? There are going to be, if there are living creatures like these pterosaurs, all these other I call them normal living cryptids, right? Running around being seen, then that's what they are. But if we have this other paranormal thing that's altering our perception of them, then we need to take seriously maybe some of these really weird accounts. That's, again, maybe none of them are what they're actually seeing. That's just the appearance they want them to have so that we don't recognize them for what they really are.
And that is a possibility. Like, when it comes to zoology, there's always the flesh and blood to it, and that's really what I do a lot of. But also, there's that more paranormal aspect to it. Like, when you look at like a lot of these, like for instance, the flying humanoid phenomenon and gargoyles.
Yes.
You look at it and like, okay, it's like I bring this up a lot of times to the researchers that do a lot of research into this. Like, what you're seeing is a 6-limbed vertebrate that doesn't exist within paleontology or zoology. So, what are these creatures? And it kind of shows, well, they got to be of some type of other origin, something that hasn't evolved and adapted here on Earth. Is it something paranormal? Is it something extraterrestrial? Is it something from another universe? No telling. But it just shows you it's something else. Also, with like the dog man and the goat man phenomenon, there's no real uh, precedent for something like that evolving here. So it shows you there must be something more paranormal in origin, and especially how old these creatures are, because references to like dragons and gargoyles and even like satyr-like creatures go back thousands of years.
Oh, they go back to the very beginning. Again, the Enkidu. You look at the earliest depictions of Enkidu
It's
in
almost
Sumerian.
like a creature.
Yeah, we would call him a goat man.
Yeah,
So it's like there is a point where you have to stop and say, look, everyone seems to universally agree these things exist, but they call them by different names. We need to recognize. I'm honestly to the point where it's like, look, we don't have any way of objectively observing the paranormal. We just don't. Because of that, once something kind of falls under that paranormal banner, I'm like, okay, boom, it gets put in that paranormal box and I don't put it to the side per se, but I'm like, okay, what that means is if it's in this box, I can't trust what somebody saw because just because they saw it doesn't mean that's what that thing is. It's what that thing is presenting itself as. And we do see cultural changes in what people see. They go from, these wild men of the woods to big, whatever it seems to be the popular thing. They do seem to change their appearance by. However, again, at Brown Springs, where we have a photograph of what appears to be something, hiding in, sort of in the back that's around 12 feet tall. And we have all these other accounts coming out of it. We found what looked to be like hoof prints that are like 12, 14 inches across. I mean, what the heck do you do with that? Well, if you think that there's a living 12 or 14 foot creature, I think you're insane.
yeah.
But does that, hoofed bipedal creature, like that's insane. However, could a paranormal creature be that tall? Well, if they're paranormal, they're outside of our normal realm to observe. It could probably take whatever form it dang well wants. And that's And maybe that's, again, it just seems like that's, again, the broader theme that we're seeing is that is the chaos is the point. We seem to, once you understand that a lot of this paranormal stuff is intelligent, it's not, again, pterosaurs are not running around with some grand scheme, right? They're just pterosaurs. They just want to live. They're just eating things, procreating, doing what any real animal would do, just like so many of these cryptids. But the paranormal stuff is intelligent. And then once you throw in that intelligence, you realize if it's intelligent and has an agenda, if it has an agenda, then you need to take that agenda into consideration. And now we may not know directly what it is, but just understanding it has an agenda is by in itself that first step to understanding, okay, if I'm being played with, then I need to recognize that. And so I should take it seriously, but not necessarily as literally as we'd like it to be.
Yeah, because and that's like one issue I do kind of see within the paranormal field sometimes, that once you put in the paranormal box, it's hard to bring it out of that box or really put more research into it because it's just so unquantifiable. And it's hard to say, like, okay, if this is some type of intelligent creature, intelligent entity behind it, how will it, what will it do to mess with you, or like make you perceive something? Like how a lot of demonologists will say demons will make themselves seem like young children in order to make you believe them and bring them into your home or
Yeah.
closer. And what if the same thing is happening with like cryptids? Like I've heard stories of people that are obsessed with Dogman or obsessed with Bigfoot, and sooner or later they start having dreams about them. And
Yeah.
then after a while, they start seeing them in their reality, like seeing them like outside their home or
Yes.
inside their local park, and they live in the middle of a city.
Yes.
So it tells me that's not a Bigfoot, that's not a Dogman, that's something else that's using it as a almost like a invisibility cloak, a cloak to say, "Hey, I'm just a big Dogman," but it's something else behind that.
Right. It's the mask it puts on.
Yes.
Right. Again, I think there are, again, look at the UFO phenomena in its totality. It's once you start looking at all of the accounts and you stop editing out the things that MUFON doesn't like, you realize this is not these are not physical creatures that are just visiting from Krypton. This is clearly a paranormal phenomena, and it shape shifts, right? It does change depending on time, depending on culture that these creatures are encountering. It is shape shifting to appear like whatever alien species you're familiar with or whatever you'd like to think they are. So we see too much of that overlap. I mean, honestly, I have this theory that most of life can be summed up with either a pie chart, preferably pumpkin, or a Venn diagram, right? And it's like whatever, any phenomena you put on a pie chart, nothing is ever 100% of that pie. There's always multiple slices to that pie. Now, the question becomes, what percentage is each slice? That's your question. Venn diagrams. Okay, what's my level of overlap? Okay, if there's some overlap, well, just because there's some overlap doesn't mean that they're connected. It may just mean, again, wolves and deer go to the same watering holes. Why? Because they're both mammals that need water. They're not the same thing. But when I start seeing overlaps, that basically the Venn diagram is not multiple circles with just teeny tiny overlaps, but they're all basically the same friggin' circle. And the only difference is, well, this one looked like it was a gray alien, and this one looked like it was a little troll, and this one looked like it was a bird person. It's like, or this one looked like it was a ghost. It's like, okay, but if what you're seeing is the only difference, but what you actually encounter, the phenomena around you that you're observing and experiencing is virtually identical, then we need to say it's the same phenomena. The thing is, there are people who make money off of them being aliens from another planet. And there are people for whom that is their, whether they wouldn't phrase it this way, but that's their religious belief. Like I have no problem with Von Daniken in general. In fact, on my Tuesday show, which is on Untold Radio, We reviewed Chariots of the Gods. I think there's a lot of things that we need to thank Von Daniken for. But one thing that is absolutely true is that whether he meant to or not, he created a new religious belief in ancient alien theory. This ancient astronaut theory is a new, that's actually not new. In fact, that's one of the things we talked about. It's just a newer version of a very old belief. But essentially, he created a new religion, which is why MUFON and a lot of these other groups will not address UFO phenomena that doesn't comport to the idea that they're aliens from another planet or from another maybe alternate universe or something. If it falls outside that paradigm, they don't want to talk about it, and they will actually sanitize their accounts because it's a religious belief to them. But if we look at it and just say, look, what are we seeing? What are we observing? What do people actually say? This happened to me. Not what people say is happening, but when people, again, like when people talk about Old Alton Bridge, like, oh, there's a creature that makes goat sounds and throws trash at you and throws old tires. I'm like, that's Jim Mars's account of what happened at Lake Worth. That's somebody putting something on it. What is it when people go to Old Alton Bridge? What do they actually see? What do they actually experience? And you realize it's not the same thing. In the same way, when you look at UFOs, when you look at paranormal, the overlap is too great to ignore. If the only difference is that one looks like it's a little gray dude and the other one looks like it's goat dude, maybe you're not seeing what it really is.
Yeah, they have that kind of perception filter they might put over it to hide their true intentions, to hide their true form.
Exactly.
To closer, to affect you in a negative way, or what, no matter what. And like that's like sometimes my issue sometimes with the whole seeing us like as a web, because sometimes you do have those pieces that you are missing, and it's hard to look at the whole puzzle sometimes because there are so many pieces of the puzzle. And if you have like, okay, you go work on the all the pieces on the right, you go work on all the pieces on the left. It's hard because if you don't bring all those pieces together at the end, then you can't get that puzzle piece.
Right.
It's like you can't have like, okay, you do go figure out all the cryptozoology, you go figure out all the ufology, you go figure out all the paranormal entities. Then let's bring all that data together. Because if we did that, there would be some misconceptions. Like you always have the idea of the paranormal versus science. You always have like religion versus science. You have a lot of people that are in the cryptozoological field see people that believe in UFOs as crazies, or
yes.
people that are in the paranormal field see people that go and hunt for Bigfoot. Like, oh, you bunch of crazy people that go hunt for a giant monster in the woods. We have all these preconceived notions and misconceptions with each other's fields that it kind of just gets all blurred and messed up at the end, and there's no real communication. Like for instance, myself, I see cryptozoology as primarily a zoological field, not exactly just a fourtean research. But the fourtean research can help back up cryptozoology.
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily mean that cryptozoology is just a true science. Ufology is a true science. It's just hard to quantify the data. Even paranormal research like demonology and parapsychology can be perceived as a science, but it's just harder to get that data. But to pursue that data, like you have people that go out and do ghost hunting that get EMF readings and EVPs and even the whole paranormal punk phenomena.
Yes.
What is that other than data? That's data to help prove the existence of some type of existence after life, but what does it also prove towards other things around it, other phenomena?
Yes.
And we have to go after that evidence and have that communication in the end and not see each other's fields as just a bunch of crazy people. Like there are certain phenomena and belief sets that I might not believe in, but just because someone else does, I don't see them as wrong or as like stupid or anything like that. I just see it's just different paradigms, different ideas, because everyone has their own perception.
Yeah. No, exactly, and that's again, it's what we try to do over at Texas Front Porch. With the Trinity Paracryptid Research Group, right? We've been doing it for years now. That was and we're not the only ones to do this by any stretch of the imagination, but we did very early on decide we wanted to bring these ghost hunters on when we were out doing this research into Bigfoot at Brown Springs. And again, with my archaeological background, the first time I went there, I'm like, hey, guys, this hill that has a modern, meaning last few hundred years, cemetery at the top. It's like, well, okay, yeah. I mean, it is a cemetery that was used by settlers, but I'm like, this is absolutely straight up an Indian burial mound. It's fallen into disrepair, but I'm like, I know what I'm looking at. Because they would have been, southern Oklahoma. It's part of the Caddoan Empire. I knew what I was looking at, and we found later evidence for that to be the case. But again, they didn't know that going into it, and I'm like, okay, well, that kind of explains a lot. And again, I can't tell you, it took years before Tex would has finally come around and say, okay, because like one of the encounters he had, where I showed up later, like it was one of the first times out there. He was making a fire and he was getting everything set up, and he said he called it a Bigfoot, but of course he doesn't see the face; it's just the shape, red glowing eyes. He sees it on the other type. It sort of fades in, looks at him for a little bit, and then just sort of disappears back into this woods, and which was again sort of like a long, sort of narrow trail that empties into the river bottoms around the Red River. And I looked at that and I'm like, Tex, this is the fall. We had rain, not too, it wasn't wet, but it was still muddy. I'm like, you're telling me this creature got within 10 feet of you, and it had to be in this area. I'm like, there's no footprints, and it makes zero sound. It was all covered in dry leaves. He should have heard something. There should be footprints. It took like a year and a half or 2 years before it took another, this very spectacular event that happened to our group at the actual cemetery before he started to admit that maybe this was not a Bigfoot that he had encountered. We had a really sort of dramatic encounter. But the point is, I think a lot of, again, I do think this paranormal phenomena is oftentimes hiding as Bigfoot or some of this other stuff, so that we don't recognize it for what it is. And so I think one of these big missing pieces is once you understand that there is an intelligence behind the paranormal stuff, you realize, oh, hold on, if it's trying to manipulate us, then a lot of stuff makes a lot more sense. If you realize that perhaps the chaos is the point, like it doesn't want us to see it for what it really is, a lot of things make a lot of sense. So we just need to be willing to have these conversations, and again, if we're going to do science is you put the data on the table and then you sort through it. The problem is a lot of the larger names in this field are bringing the paradigms to the table, and they put the evidence in the paradigm, and that's what's causing our problem. We believe that the Bigfoot Gordian knot can only be solved by slicing it in half and saying we need to undo all these knots. This is not one thing. This is probably multiple phenomena that we're calling Bigfoot, and we need to start sorting this out differently. Because if we don't, we are 50 years into this honest investigation into Bigfoot, and we are no closer to figuring it out than we were 50 years ago. I think we've got some really interesting developments with like the Sasquatch albivernix that once Doug Hydrick gets the funding on, we're going to be able to test. That's very exciting material. So I'm looking forward to that test going through. But at this present moment, we're really no closer at all to sort of figuring out like the Bigfoot part of it. I haven't found, I'm looking for a body of like a juvenile pterosaur, right? Because I think, again, if they're reptiles, they would leave, they don't have a nest like a bird. They're, doing, they're laying their eggs and they're leaving. The eggs are hatching. Well, that means there's probably some of these things that are dying very, very early on. Well, if I can find a juvenile that has died, then I can collect that body, and we would have evidence, physical evidence for these creatures. So, I mean, we're at this point, though, I think a lot of what's held us back is that too many people have brought their paradigms to the table, and they're not willing to say, okay, what are we seeing? What is the actual evidence? personal bulls be danged, right? Golden calves are, sometimes have to get gored for science to move forward. And we need to be willing to do that, or we're never going to get anywhere with this. And honestly, I think the confusion and the chaos is the point, because there are people who have, in the mainstream academics, like, let's leave the paranormal stuff, let's leave all that to the side. I think there's a large movement both within our government and within academia to suppress this stuff, because they have a worldview that they want to champion. And if anything that falls outside that worldview is automatically kicked out, because I think there's political reasons, I think there's financial reasons, but there is the active opposition to anyone asking these questions is very, very real. It's tangible.
Yes, like with me, I was talking about this when I cryptozoology and just paranormal and 14 research in the first place. You have to change that paradigm. You have to change the idea that, oh, that's because it's outside of normal existence, it doesn't exist. Or
Yep.
that, oh, it's so strange, and like with certain cryptids, oh, it's so human like, it can't exist. Not necessarily. You have to change your paradigm to the data that you get. If once Columbus discovered, well, quote unquote, discovered North America, if people would have kept on thinking the world was flat, that would have been acidine and idiotic. They changed their paradigm to the data that was collected. If we don't do that nowadays, we're just going to be kept in ignorance. So we have to change our worldview, change our ideas. And if we don't, we'll just live in blissful ignorance.
Well, and that's Tony, you got me started on the whole flat Earth thing, but
Yeah.
one of but I had a episode a couple weeks, probably a couple months ago now. Everything blurs together when you get old like me. Where someone had asked, is there a secret library somewhere where all the world's hidden, where the hidden knowledge is? And the answer that I came to was, well, yes and no. The problem is, I mean, yeah, there is a secret repository of human knowledge that would answer a lot of questions. The problem is it's not hidden in some torture dungeon beneath the Vatican or under some Egyptian pyramid. It's behind a paywall. I mean, that's really the truth of it. Is academics, right? We have all this information that archaeologists have pulled up. Again, there are people doing good work. There really are. There's scientists doing good work. There really, really is. And it's going in journals that people don't really know about because they haven't paid for them. That's it. Like, there's a paywall. And there aren't a lot of people who are a part of that community coming out and saying, hey, here's the information that you aren't aware of, that puts a lot of these things into that calls this mainstream narrative into question. Again, it's conversation that happens in academia all the time, and they're very open about it. The problem is, unless someone is there to shine a light on it and say, hey, this is the conversation that's being had, here's the nuances to it, we, the public, never see it. One of the things I'm looking into right now for my new book is, again, I've had the very superficial understanding of it, so I want to get a better understanding of it. As far as the conversation's happening now, is carbon-14 dating. Now, don't get me wrong. I've said, again, since my experience in mainstream academia, it's like, hold on, carbon-14 dating is screwed up. Like, it is really, it's so remarkably unreliable that we treat it like it's this holy grail, like it's the silver bullet, and it's not. But there is a journal of basically radiocarbon dating where it talks about things, and the problem is we keep finding carbon-14 and things that aren't supposed to have carbon-14. In fact, I forget who it is. One of the big paleontologists. I want to say it's Baker, but I may be wrong. I can see him, but again, I'm terrible with names. One of the things he was talking about is I've heard him say this on a radio show. Someone asked him, it's like, hey, this, have you ever thought about carbon dating this soft tissue that you're finding in dinosaur bones? And he said, no. He said straight up, I don't want to have them carbon dated because I don't want to give another talking point to creationists. Now, I'm sorry, but as someone who does care about science, the data should lead you. if you're deliberately withholding, because he's had numerous offers to say, look, we will pay for the whole process to have this carbon dated. They won't do it. Why? Because they're worried about because they know for a fact they'll find carbon-14. I'm sorry, but the biggest smoking gun that the whole millions of years thing is a lie is the soft tissue and active hemoglobin that we found in fossilized dinosaur bones. The bones were fossilized. They weren't put in some sort of chamber where time stops. If these things are 60, 100, 80, 100 million years old, then all of that soft tissue should have turned to dust. That hemoglobin should have turned to dust. The fact that we've got soft tissue that we can get DNA from, the fact that we have hemoglobin that we can use to say, hey, in fact, we know a T-Rex is related to a chicken thing came from experiments we did with the active Tyrannosaurus Rex hemoglobin we found. If they're active enough that we can get antigens from them to interact with chicken stuff, so we can say, yeah, they're related. I'm sorry. That is not millions upon millions of years old. That is thousands of years at best. There's no way that those things are still viable after millions of years. In fact, the guy who first discovered it said, with a Triceratops skull or a horn, he cut it open and found it. He thought it said, in fact, he's been highly suppressed because he was the first one who said, hey, this stuff proves these things are not millions of years old. They're at best thousands. They can't even be tens of thousands of years old. If you push the fossilization really past, I'm going to be the most outlandish, 15 to 20,000 years, there's no way that stuff's still viable. It just can't be. We are talking about thousands of years for these creatures to have lived, been killed, and fossilized at the same time. Whatever killed them, fossilized them. There's no way. There's no other explanation for that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have soft tissue. We sure as the world wouldn't have these quote unquote fossilized mummies where we have skin and organs all preserved as fossils. This was whatever happened to them was rapid, and it's the thing that killed them. And it happened thousands of years ago, not millions. But that also explains why we do see them to this day. Why are we seeing pterosaurs? Why do we have a history of pterosaurs? Why do we have history of animals that, if you look through, that we find in the fossil record? Because there isn't millions and billions of years here. There's only thousands. And these creatures were all wiped out at the same time. That makes, again, that's the evidence. That's what the evidence should tell us. Otherwise, why? Because even the idea of fossilized tracks, right? How do we have fossil tracks if they weren't fossilized almost immediately? Think about how quickly a track erodes. And particularly the tracks that we have, that has to be in like a form of clay. It can't just be in like some, the dirt inside of a forest. It has to be on like a clay to get the sort of impressions that we're getting. I'm sorry. When was the last time you were out and you saw a print older than a couple of days, week at most?
Yeah.
Under any circumstances.
Yeah, you really don't see that, like, because it gets covered up or erosion or, heck, just if it's millions of years old, plate tectonics will move it, things like that.
Oh, exactly. And again, it goes back to look at the Delk print. We have numerous accounts of human and dinosaur footprints being in the same strata and even overlapping. The Delk print is the most famous. And everyone says, of course, it's immediately dismissed as, well, it must be faked. Why? Well, because humans and dinosaurs didn't live at the same time. Okay, then please explain to me why, when Dr. Baugh had that CT scanned, we can actually see the compression layers in the rock. We can see where the pressure of where the theropod put its foot. We can see the compression layers, and we can see the compression layers where the human footprint is. That's not carved. That was there when it was fossilized. And we have these all over the place. The problem is that disrupts a narrative that mainstream academia wants to have. Again, look at the fact that look at all these mammoths we keep finding that are frozen, right? And basically mummified in ice. We have found them with summer grasses still in their mouths, undigested buttercups in their stomachs. That is not something that was wandering around on some, frozen Siberian wasteland during an ice age and just succumbed to the cold and died and just got covered by permafrost. That was an animal that was living in a warm to temperate climate with summer grasses that was frozen nearly instantly. Now, I don't know about you, but I couldn't imagine the kind of situation that it would take to freeze a mastodon in a cold, in what is clearly a summer climate. What kind of event could possibly do that? Unless it was something so utterly catastrophic that it could, I don't know, kill and fossilize dinosaurs, fossilize fresh footprints in what was mud at the time. It would have to be a phenomenally, unimaginably catastrophic event that could freeze creatures of that size in a summer climate so fast that their food hasn't digested. That's not a narrative that they want to talk about. They will not talk about that. You ask them, why do they have summer grasses in their mouth? They'll be like, well, we don't really know. I'm sorry. That's kind of a big part of the story here.
Yeah. Because I am not a creationist or anything like that. I do believe that these go back millions of years, but there is evidence to disprove that. And these are very interesting theories and hypotheses, but it's just something I would put in more research into myself, because this is not what I've researched. And
no, I understand.
My perspective is the whole paleontology, 65 million years, and those dates. But I know there's evidence to disprove it, all kind of go against it. So I would love to do research into that. And that's actually one thing I want to do a little bit more now, is do research into the whole creation hypothesis and see, okay, could it be that these creatures are more likely to exist maybe more thousands of years ago? Because that would help the ideas of living dinosaurs and living pterosaurs. Because then instead of 65 million years, it's more like 66,000 years or even more recent.
Yeah, well, exactly, and that's sort of again, which is why, honestly, why does cryptozoology get the pushback from mainstream academia? My theory, my suggestion is that all of this stuff pushes back against the mainstream narrative, the narrative that people have made their degrees on, all their grants are based on. And I'd even ask the question, why do you think the government supports that? Do you think, let's be honest, do we think the government has anyone's best interest at heart? No. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of people with a lot of money who have a lot of agendas. And again, look at Einstein. People didn't, he didn't come up with his theories in 1905 or 1915, I forget which date it is. And everyone was like, wow, this is a brilliant guy. Let's change all of our models of physics and mathematics to. No, they opposed him actively for decades. It took a long time before he was accepted. There was evidence for it. Well, this is honestly the difference. The young earth, and again, young earth I use with a very broad understanding here. I think there's a lot of nuance that does get lost in a lot of these conversations, and it's like, there are different questions here, but let's be honest, whether it's 6,000, 7,000, 15,000, 30,000 years ago, those are all people sitting at the same table having the same entree, right? Or having this, having a conversation. The difference between that and hundreds of millions of years, that's an entirely different restaurant in an entirely different country. The difference between them is so great that it changes the nature of politics and the agenda, right? This is the problem is this is a political thing just as much as it is a science thing. Science is political whether we like it or not, because science allows us to say humans are either worthless or they're valuable. Science allows us to say those people are people or those people aren't people. And that is what science has been used for centuries. Science is politics. It is, and it serves the political, whether we like it or not. It is what it is. Once we have to understand that that academia is holding hands with the government, and the problem is there's an agenda there. They have thoughts, and the government's going to do that which is going to support the science that they like the most, that gives them what they want, whatever their narrative is. And we this is not a new idea. This has always been going on. Again, go back as far as you want. Science and politics are intertwined. And that's why we're on the outside, because these creatures, this phenomena, is all evidence that the mainstream narrative, the narrative that apparently the people with the money want it to be, they're the evidence that it's wrong. And they find that, I think, not just ideologically dangerous, but they find it politically dangerous.
Yeah, like I kind of would science being used as politics. Like look at for thousands of years. Look at like religious thinking. The Bible was at one time used as almost as propaganda, and it's how governments or whoever is in power uses whatever knowledge is available, whether it's it long as it's science or religion or even just mass media. It's all form of some type of governmental control, and like how science can, especially now because we're in such a technologically evolved culture, they can use science as a way to make people perceive a certain way or make people's perceptions kind of go coincide with what they want them to believe. And it's kind of something you see and something that is not scientific in the first place. Science is about finding the truth of reality and the universe around us, no matter what the cost. And when your reality is making be perceived by the government or some other outward body, that's no longer science. That's just propaganda at that point.
Well, it's a religion.
Yeah,
We've entered the age of what's called scientism. It is a religious doctrine. When people say the science, that's a religious dogma. That's not science. Science is a tool. That's all it is. But we treat it as if it's a religion. We really do. I mean, people have faith. They're like, I have faith in science. That's like saying I have faith in a hammer. You don't have faith in a hammer. It's something you use. Science is done with certain protocols. There are ways to do it. The problem is, again, science, politics, they're ultimately interconnected. This has become a religion. And again, anything that endangers this modern scientism religious doctrine is anathema. It's treated that way.
yes. And but it's just interesting how you see that within like, especially modern culture.
Well, it's again, humans, Christians, we would call it the God-shaped hole. There's a God-shaped hole in everyone's heart. You're going to worship something whether you like it or not. You fill it with something. This modern drive is to use, again, I use quote unquote science because it's not science. Science is a tool. It is a process. This is a religious dogma, which is why and again, as a religious person, I'm sitting here looking at this and like, this is religious language that's even being used, right? This is, since this is on YouTube and stuff, I don't want to, get you banned, but just look at the last couple of years. There's stuff. It's like when you actually look at real science and real data, you realize so much of what we've done over the last few years, particularly in the medical world. Again, look at what with SSRIs, what just came out in last month about that, Alzheimer's, and quote unquote other things. Look at what people actually say, what actual real data says. You realize this is almost performative. Like so much of what we've been forced to do over the last few years is not scientifically driven. This was religious behavior, and it's painted that way. It's even presented as in religious dogma. It's like you can't question the science. Science, if you can't question it, it's not science. That's propaganda. It's dogma, but it's not science. The entire point of science is to question it. It is to say, here's your theory. Let me take it apart and see if I can put it back together again. Or where's the failures of your theory? That is the entire point of science. But our modern culture doesn't treat it that way. We've made men in lab coats the new high priest.
Yeah, that's something I can agree with to an extent. And I know this is I hate to stop and make conversation, but I am noticing that we are getting past about 1.5 hours. And I know I don't want to make this too long because I know.
People got real lives.
Yeah, I can understand, especially on a Sunday, especially. So I was going to say, well, real quick, Jason, if you want to, of course, if people can find you, if they want to hear about you, if they want to go listen to you talk or anything like that, ask you questions, how can I get a hold of you, man?
Just go to Texas Front Porch, TEX''S Front Porch. That's where you'll find me 3 days a week, and you can, and all of our contacts are on there. Or you can go to Siru Papers, SIRU papers.com. Then it's got all the links and stuff that you can, again, you can find the channel, you can email me. And again, on Tuesdays, I'm on Untold Radio AM with Mysterious Library, but you probably can't contact me through there. Easiest is going to be Texas Front Porch.
Okay, perfect. And of course, I've had Tex on, and we've always talked and all that. And you're a great guy to talk to, and I know this episode's gone really great so far. And I know Texas Front Porch. If you guys want to go support them, go support them. Like Jason's on there. Also, the other guy, big from Michigan, Rob. I'm trying to get out to the show in the future. Also, a great guy to talk to, and of course, Tex. So it's a good channel to go listen to, people.
Ryan, it's been fun. I appreciate you having me on.
Of course. Well, great having you on, Jason, and have a good day, everyone. See ya.